Okay, good afternoon everyone. It is a real pleasure to be here today with you. I'm really surprised. I have been talking about gender equality for 3 days in a row with, international organizations, with, the political parties, with civil society. And well, I think this room clearly shows that everything that is done for, increasing the percentage of female MPs, it is necessary because I almost, I would say that here the quota are the men, right? So this is very nice to see that, what I have been defending for the last 3 days, it is a necessary policy, and I hope, the governing party and the parties in parliament adopt this new quota, hopefully 40%. That this is what, they were pledging, on Monday, okay? Yeah, so I'm here today. I have been asked to talk about a topic that it is usually neglected, a topic that has not been regulated so much, but still is very important if we want to have, really proper regulations. So I'm going to have this presentation on third-party funding, the challenges and the international standards. I'm happy to, answer any questions, comments that you may have, after it, and talk also about other topics that you are interested, beyond, third-party finance, like it could be, the gender equality, party law, electoral law, constitutional politics, whatever you need. Okay, so the first thing that we need to know is what is a third party, okay? So because, even if you see in, Greco documents, Greco is the group of states, against corruption of the Council of Europe, you can still, see that they use third-party finance sometimes, in a different way, right? So let's try to clarify what we are talking about when we talk about third party. When you look at the, when you look at the guidelines of political party regulation that were passed and approved by the Venice Commission and the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights in 2020, one of the contributors was me too. They say that a third party refer to individuals and organizations who are not legally tied to or acting in coordination with any candidate or political party, but who nonetheless act with the aim of influencing the electoral result. As you can see, I'm going to refer a lot to the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights because I am the member of the core group of political party experts. I work with them a lot in different opinions that we have in terms of changes, legislative reform, and also a lot of the things that I'm going to say today are based on their documents and also on a policy paper that was written by a colleague of mine, Dr. Magnus Åhman, who works for IFES, the International Foundation of Electoral Systems, but prepared this paper on third-party finance for ODIHR. In the ODIHR Campaign Finance Observation Handbook, that is used also as the main document for international observation of elections, they say that third-party financing refers to campaign expenditures made independently of a candidate or party with the aim of promoting or opposing a candidate or party, either directly or indirectly. Let's try to see how third parties are different from other concepts that are used during elections and campaign finance, okay? So, third party, for you to understand and go beyond these legal documents, right, is an entity that not presenting candidates in elections still engage financially in campaigns. Could it be purchasing, advertising, information materials? We will talk later about different ways of, how third-party finance engage. But, it's important that you take into consideration that third-party concept excludes, okay, entities that fundraise in favor of a direct contestant, party, candidate, give money to those contestants, but which do not spend any funds themselves or engage in campaign activities. So third parties are different from parties themselves, from candidates, right? From coalitions of parties, from citizen lists, from party lists, because these are what we call direct contestants in elections. And then there is this so-called independent spending, refer many times, especially in the United States, but this third-party activity undertaken without concert, agreement, coordination, or pursuant to a common plan with any direct participant. Okay. So before we go to the international standards of how this should be regulated and how it is regulated in some countries, right? It's important that we understand why should we regulate third parties and third-party finance. So the first reason is increased transparency. Everything is about increasing transparency. Why? Because transparency is one of the main pillars, elements of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. Is one of the core principles of the Council of Europe recommendations on political finance. And also, it is one of the main pillars of the OECD framework on financing democracy, support better public policies, and asserting policy capture. Sorry, but it's a very long name. So the idea is that, if a lot of the campaign finance go through third parties, then, for example, all reporting obligations that political parties and candidates have will not work. That's why, for example, it is very important that, there are obligations of third parties for reporting, because, it will not only increase the information that you voters have of the electoral process, but, it will also give you the whole picture of how, campaign finance have taken place in a given election. The second one is about, ensure that the regulatory objectives are not undermined, meaning that, the objectives of their party funding regulations are not, undermined. A lot of OSCE countries, to which, Mongolia belongs to, right, they include limits on donations and limits on spending, because the idea is to avoid the excessive influence of wealthy men in politics, and also to reduce the amount of money in the political process. That's why, to close possible loopholes in the legislation and, for example, ensure the efficiency of those limits that you have for parties and candidates, limits of spending should also be applied to third parties. Also because, we need to guarantee equal opportunity, right? The idea is that, everybody has to have a chance to participate, chance, to have an influence in politics. This is something that, for example, the Canadian Supreme Court has, continuously, repeated. Because political equality is also one of the pillars of the OECD framework I was mentioning at the beginning. Because at the end of the day, it's important that we also protect political parties. The idea is to ensure a balance between the involvement of third parties, but also ensure that the voice of parties and candidates in the electoral process are not drawn out. Because, if we do not regulate third parties, if we leave third parties, to live like in a jungle, then what we are doing is to make them in competition with what are the main actors of an elections, which are political parties. So for all these reasons, it's very important that, party finance laws, party laws, electoral laws, have regulations on third-party funding. So the idea that, if a country is going to regulate third-party, it is important that the goals, the objectives of this regulation are clear. The idea is that, if the regulations are clear, the oversight authorities and other actors can also judge if the regulations in the law have been properly implemented. And the rules need to be carefully drafted, because if we also restrict the activities of third party, then we have a problem. We have a problem because, we are threatening and, overcoming certain principles like the freedom of participation and organization. So, what are the international standards in terms of, third-party regulation? I'm going to draw a lot on this document, the guidelines of political party regulation that I mentioned before, and also on the documents of the Council of Europe, especially this recommendation of the Committee of Ministers to Member States on common rules against corruption in the funding of political parties and electoral campaigns. So, what the Council of Europe and the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights tell us. So, Article 6 of these recommendations that I just mentioned said that rules concerning donations to political parties should also apply as appropriate to all entities which are related directly or indirectly to a political party or are otherwise under the control of a political party. The ODIHR 2015 Campaign Finance Handbook that I also mentioned says that third parties should be free to fundraise and express views on political issues as a means of free expression, and their activity should not be unconditionally prohibited. However, it is important that some form of regulation be extended to these third parties that are involved in the campaign to ensure transparency and accountability. In 2011, we have the first guidelines of political party regulation. You will see now how this issue of the third-party finance regulation has evolved and has become more and more important. In 2011, only one article of the guidelines referred to third-party finance. And you can see that it was rather general. It says legislation should provide clear guidelines regarding which activities are not allowable during the pre-election campaign, and income and expenditures used for such activities during this time should be subject to proper review and sanction. Legislation should clearly state to whom political party funds may be released in the pre-election period and the limitations upon their use by third parties not directly associated with the party. When we were meeting in order to revise the guidelines in 2018 and 2019, we felt that this article was not enough. That third-party finance has been increasing over time, in all OSCE countries. Therefore, a more specific, regulation, and guidelines would be needed. I know that all this legal stuff can be a bit boring. Okay, so in the new, guidelines, we have, I think it's 4 or 5 articles that lead with this. I'm just going to summarize here, the most important parts of those. Okay. So Article 2020 of the new guidelines says to avoid loopholes through which unlimited funding can be channeled and financial transactions can be bailed, law should set proportionate and reasonable limits to the amount that third parties can spend on promoting candidates and or parties, ideally by applying existing ceilings, caps for donations to political parties to these sectors. Article 221 says these limits should only apply in cases where third parties and their actions are intended to benefit specific parties, either in general or during campaigns. Article 221 says this should not prevent NGOs and other interest groups from debating issues of public interest during the campaigns without undermining the level playing field for the electoral contestants. NGOs and other associations engaging in democracy promotion and general issue advocacy should not generally be treated in the same way as parties and through electoral third parties, so they are not really third parties, in particularly in the area of access to resources and reporting obligation. And then finally, I added this because it is also part of the section dealing with third party regulation. It may be not as important yet to Mongolia, because you have more important problems to resolve, right? But for example, in my own country, you see how sometimes political parties reduce public finance, but they increase finance to their foundations. So you see a perfect correlation of the decrease of finance to parties and the perfect increase of funds for the foundations, which in a way compensates for what they are losing. So in many countries, in fact, they are left outside the legislation, creating a huge loophole, right? That's why, political foundations should be included within the same supervisory legislation and be bound by those requirements to which political parties must adhere. So now that we have finished with the most boring part, which is, the legal, international standards, right? We are going to more concrete. Sorry about that, but it's important to understand this because, any single legislation in the OSCE region, including that of Mongolia, need to respect those standards that are the basis of everything that we are talking here, even if, as I said, it is boring to present them. So, there are 4 different ways how third parties can get involved, right, in politics. The first one is they may engage without favoring or targeting a direct contestant. So basically, this is what is called issue advocacy, right? This is the typical activity. So it's when entities, there are certain entities, right, that ask parties, candidates to give their view on a particular issue. They have certain, demands on adopting a specific, issue that will lead to legislative reform. In general, this type of involvement is not regulated in, OSCE countries. For example, in Ireland, you have activities with, they mention a political purpose. In the United Kingdom, for example, political broadcasting activities are banned, paid. They have this regulation on activities with a political purpose. And, for example, in the Czech Republic, sometimes these entities have registered themselves as third parties, right? Then we have, what is called, independent spending. I already mentioned a bit about this. That is when these entities campaign in favor or against a direct competitor, but without coordinating with. And in countries like the United States that they care about corruption, but they don't care about equality, which is one of the principles of the OSCE countries, right? They don't tend to regulate this kind of activity. Some legislations is to introduce some limitations, but they tend to be the exception. Now we arrive to what I think everybody in this room is really thinking when thinking about third parties, right? The campaigning in coordination with a direct contestant, so in coordination with a party or a candidate. This, is usually an activity done by registered entities, but, in coordination with a direct contestant, right? Even if they are not formally connected. And this is the key. Most OSCE legislations, so, in a way we cannot blame, Mongolia for not having, this. They do not tend to deal with the issue of coordination. But for example, you have in the country where I live and work, the United Kingdom as an exception, they talk about coordinated activity if pursued according to a common plan with the direct contestant. In France, for example, the Constitutional Court ordered that a candidate lost his seat because of an activity that was done by a legal entity in coordination with him, for example, during the campaign, of course. So the question is, in the UK, as I mentioned, in case of these coordinated activities, this is considered to be a contribution of the entity that does the activity in coordination with the party, right, to the spending limit. So in other words, in UK you have spending limits. This entity acts to favor this party in coordination with the party. This activity is calculated as adding to the spending limits. If the party is above the general spending limit because of this activity that adds up, then the party gets a fine. If the party or the candidate forget to declare this coordinated activity, then it's considered to be a case of corruption, and the party or candidate can get a fine, can be even condemned to prison, or they could even lose, the possibility in the future to hold a public office. I mentioned before, in the US they have a different approach to Europe. It's not so much about guaranteeing an equal playing field, it's about corruption. So in the US, there are no spending limits, but there are contribution limits. So this activity in coordination with the candidate is considered to be part of the contribution. So it adds to the contribution limit. If, because of this activity, they are beyond the contribution limits, then they also get a fine. And then we have, the campaigning by entities that are directly related to a political party. Think of the youth wing of a party. Think of the women's wing of a party. Think of think tanks connected to a party. They are not candidates per se, but they are normally very actively engaged in the parties, right? And in most cases, in most legislations of the OSCE, what happens is that they are treated as if they were parties. So, for example, in Sweden, they call them side organizations. And the parties themselves are obliged to report on any activity contribution that they made, in the campaign. So, in summary, third parties, and this is something that, we shouldn't forget, and sometimes, it is forgotten, are part of the whole party finance regulation framework and should have the same rules for parties, candidates applied to them. How, we regulate third parties? Well, sometimes the question is simply, should we ban them altogether or should we not? For example, the Constitution of Nigeria bans third-party finance altogether, okay? But in OSCE countries, this is impossible because of what I was mentioning about the importance of the principle of equality. Third-party expenditures may not be banned, but they may be subject to limitations that are reasonable and proportional. This comes from a ruling of the European Court of Human Rights of 1998 in the case Bowman versus the United Kingdom. So before I go to how third parties are regulated, right, in OSCE countries, first I will show a bit of trends in the world, but I will focus more on OSCE countries. I think that, it is important that we understand which issues need to be addressed when introducing third-party regulation. So the idea is, who is included in the third-party regulation? For example, some countries ban foreigners to finance political parties. Other countries, ban trade unions from, financing political parties. Other countries ban companies from banning political parties. The important thing is that there is a connection between these bans and third-party finance. Because, for example, if you ban companies from funding parties, but later you allow companies to act as third parties in coordination with the parties, then the regulation makes no sense at all. The second thing is what type of third party involvement should be regulated. Do you remember we were talking about different types of involvement? In this sense, the law should have a workable definition of which type of involvement, because you saw that there are 4 different types of involvement, and it is also that we understand how we are going to judge the activity regulated. It could be by an independent person that say, well, this type of activity is a third-party activity, or it could be, done in, by an independent assessment, for example, right? Or simply by the actions and assertions of the third party, right? In the UK, they say, spending that can reasonably be regarded as intended to promote or favor electoral success for a party or a candidate. So intended to promote is already enough in the UK to consider third-party activity. Most legislations are not as, let's say, advanced as the British one. In the British, as I mentioned, is about those that campaign in favor or disfavor of a party, right? And also intend to promote. Most of OSCE legislations just stop on favor or disfavor a party, independently of there is coordination or not. Then, it's a question of which type of spending of third parties is going to be regulated. Is, for example, only billboards? Imagine, an entity puts a billboard in favor of a political party, or, for example, polls that are done in order to check if the message of the party is being effective. Should these polls be included as third-party spending? For example, in the United Kingdom, before 2014, only election materials were regulated as part of third-party spending. But they realized that this was not enough, that there were a lot of activities that should be included. And now it includes canvassing, market, of course, resources, press conferences, as considered to be also, or even transport and public rallies in events are also considered as part of the spending of third parties. And the last issue is the time period, because there are certain countries that establish a specific period for campaigning, right? If you want to apply them to both, the same time period, well, then perhaps, it's not so much controversial. But the problem is when, for example, the rules for third parties are applied to a shorter period. Then you need a specific, anti-circumvention rules that third parties can use beyond that period. So, types of third-party regulations. Well, you have, for example, in terms of registration, in some countries, you may require, third parties to be registered, in a register as entities, and only then they can act, as third parties. And the main aim for that, of course, is transparency, because everybody knows who are the third parties, right? But also easiness of control. Oversight authority is able to control those entities because they know that they are registered and how they will act. In terms of private finance, you can include also donation bans, in relation to third parties, that they are aimed to guarantee equality and avoid, and manage risk, and also, to establish donation limits. So this way you avoid the circumvention of rules. In terms of spending, you can introduce spending caps, spending limitations that once again avoid the circumvention of rules, and also avoid undue influences, because there are those that are richer and can spend more and can have a higher influence in politics. You can also ban advertising, because this way you create equal playing field among the direct contestants. So not only the rich can be helped by these third parties, but also you reduce costs. At the end of the day, politicians don't realize you can be very successful without spending much. You just need to be strategic and know how to do, things. There are certain European countries where, campaigns are very, very cheap. And of course, you can oblige third parties to financially report in order to increase the transparency of income and spending that are connected with the electoral process. So, just briefly, there is not much on regulations, and there is not much even data on those regulations, right? But International IDEA has this wonderful, data set with, party finance regulations all over the world. And they look into these two issues that I was mentioning before. You remember when I was talking about, UK spending, US contribution. So in terms of spending, we can see in the map that 53.9 of the countries in the world do not have limits on spending of third parties. And you see important countries, United States, Australia, Brazil, France, Germany, Sweden, Finland. 13.3 ban altogether spending by third party. 8.9, only 8.9, include spending limits of third parties. And 7.2 do this issue that I was talking about, that the spending limits are included in the spending of parties, candidates on their behalf. And then in terms of reporting, so there is no data on the donation side, at least global in global terms. I will be talking about this in the next slide about the donations. But you see that 57.2 of the countries in the world do not ask third parties to report on finance. We know already that 30.3% of countries ban, third parties, involvement, right? So this already was said in the previous slide. The interesting thing is that only 11.1 of the countries of the world require third parties to report, and 1.7 sometimes. So 11.1 is always, 1.7 sometimes. I don't want to go into detail. I just put here some examples, right, of countries that have been regulating, spending caps, like Belgium, France, Ireland, and the United Kingdom. As you can see, spending is let's say the issue that it has been more regulated. For example, in terms of donation bans, you have Ireland, Sweden, but only indirectly, and the United Kingdom in some cases. Ireland and the United Kingdom as perhaps, if you really in the future want to look into third-party spending, third-party finance, you should look into their legislations because they tend to be the most complete, as you can see from here. So we are reaching the end of the presentation, and what I want to say is that all these regulations are really good, are really cool, right? And introduce them is important. But Without their implementation and without an oversight authority that controls that these regulations are applied, nothing will work. You know, in terms of reporting, you need itemized regular financial reports, parties, candidates, third parties. You need these reports to be timely and easy accessible, public disclosure for an extended period of time. So people, you guys, the journalists, the political scientists, have to be able to access easily those reports for 6, 8, 7 years, 10 years, in order to really make the control of third parties. We need an oversight authority that is fully independent and sufficiently financially and humanly resourceful and has clearly defined competences, including the capacity to initiate investigations, coordinate with other authorities, and impose sanctions. Without that, everything that I have told you about the benefits of third-party regulation will not work. Sanctions that need to be clear, realistic, effective, dissuasive, and proportional. And they can be of different types: financial, administrative, criminal, both for parties, including third parties and individuals. So, as my dear friend Marcin Baleski, who was the head of the democratization department of OSCE always mentioned, in order to have a proper party finance regulatory framework, you need three things, like the body. You need a brain, so you need a good, regulation. You need a heart. You need to have a political will to implement the law, but you need the muscles, meaning a full-fledged oversight authority. Okay, so I end with this slide. What are the recommendations? When you include regulations of third party, the regulatory goals have to be clearly stated. They should be including regulations of some, if not all, of these aspects: registration, donation, and spending, and reporting. In the worst case scenario, if you don't want to specifically regulate third party finance, you need to apply every single rule that you use for parties and candidates to the third parties. You need, of course, as I mentioned, the muscles, right? Remember, the independent and resourceful oversight authority that has to have clear guidelines to third parties. So the oversight authority is not just, the bad teacher that is there to punish you. The oversight authority is also your big brother and your best friend in a way. Meaning that, the oversight authority needs to interact with the third parties and explain which type of activities are considered third-party finance, how they should be reported, what are, the different limitations that you have. So the illegal financing is avoided. And then, of course, it's important to have a regular regulatory review of, the legislation. Thank you very much for your attention.